Join us on Patreon and become part of our journey to uncover history's untold stories. Your support helps us create in-depth content, bring hidden narratives to life, and keep history alive for everyone.
The story of history, as it has so often been told in the halls of European universities, libraries, and dusty archives, is one where Africa appears only as a supporting character, an unnamed backdrop to empires in Mesopotamia, Persia, Greece, and Rome. In this tale, Europe casts itself as the keeper of biblical history, the guardian of sacred texts, and the inheritor of the legacy of Israel. Yet buried beneath centuries of rewriting, suppression, and silence lies a different record, one that deeply unsettled European scholars when they encountered it. It was the story of African Hebrew kingdoms, lineages, and communities that claimed descent from the very people of the Bible. These kingdoms and traditions were not myth, but living realities that stretched from the highlands of Ethiopia to the forests of West Africa, and their existence challenged the very foundations of European racial hierarchies, colonial projects, and theological supremacy. When European travelers, missionaries, and scholars stumbled upon these traditions, their first instinct was not to record them with pride, but to bury them in suspicion and fear. For if Africans were not only heirs to Israelite bloodlines, but also builders of kingdoms rooted in Hebrew law, scripture, and culture, then the European story of superiority crumbled. To acknowledge the depth of African Hebraic civilization was to admit that the Bible, Europe's greatest cultural treasure, did not belong to Europe alone. It meant that Africa, too, was a chosen land with a chosen people. This was a terrifying proposition for a Europe that was building its power on the exploitation of Africa and on the erasure of African intellectual and spiritual authority. The most enduring and controversial case lay in Ethiopia. For centuries, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church held traditions that placed the Ark of the Covenant itself within its borders. The Keber Nagast, the Ethiopian national epic, declared that the Queen of Sheba bore a son with King Solomon, Menelik I, who carried the Ark to Ethiopia, establishing a Solomonic dynasty that endured for millennia. This was not folklore whispered in villages. It was an institution of state, a theology that crowned emperors, legitimized dynasties, and gave Ethiopia an identity as both Christian and Hebraic. European visitors could hardly believe their eyes when they encountered a kingdom in Africa that not only claimed descent from Israel, but also presented itself as a guardian of biblical treasures older than Rome. This claim was not easily dismissed, for Ethiopia's traditions were reinforced by physical practices that mirrored the Hebrew world. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserved circumcision, dietary laws echoing the kosher codes of Leviticus, and Saturday observance of the Sabbath in addition to Sunday worship. Its liturgy was infused with Old Testament references, and its priests chanted psalms in Guizi, an ancient Semitic tongue related to Hebrew and Aramaic. The church's monasteries held manuscripts that stunned European scholars, for they contained apocryphal and canonical works long lost in Europe. Books such as the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and other texts that had been excluded from the Western Bible. These were not pale imitations, but authentic writings copied from antiquity and preserved with meticulous care. Their presence in Africa contradicted the narrative that Europe alone had safeguarded divine revelation. But Ethiopia was not the only kingdom to carry Hebraic traditions. Across the Sahel, in the region of ancient Mali and Songhai, Jewish and Hebraic communities flourished, often interwoven with Islamic societies. Timbuktu, famed as a center of Islamic scholarship, also held records of Jewish traders, scholars, and communities that had migrated from North Africa and Spain after the expulsions of the 15th century. These communities were not tolerated anomalies, but respected participants in the intellectual and economic life of the region. Yet even before these migrations, African oral traditions spoke of Israelite ancestry in tribes scattered across West Africa, from the Igbo of Nigeria to the Lemba of Southern Africa, both of whom preserved rituals, genealogies, and oral histories that bore striking resemblance to ancient Hebrew life. For European scholars, the most disconcerting of these were the Igbo of southeastern Nigeria. Missionaries in the 19th century began reporting that the Igbo circumcised their sons on the 8th day, observed purity laws similar to Leviticus, maintained taboos against eating pork, and practiced a form of Passover remembrance with unleavened bread. Some Igbo elders even recited genealogies that traced back to Jacob and his sons. While these claims were often dismissed as coincidence or explained away by colonial officials, they were too numerous and consistent to ignore. The possibility that entire African nations had preserved Hebrew traditions outside of European influence cast doubt on the monopoly of European theology. In southern Africa, the Lemba people presented yet another challenge. Anthropologists and missionaries documented their dietary restrictions, priestly clan structure, and oral traditions claiming descent from Jewish ancestors who migrated from the north, possibly from Yemen or ancient Israel itself. In the late 20th century, genetic studies even confirmed that a segment of the Lemba priestly line carried the Cohen modal haplotype associated with Jewish priestly families. For Europe, which had long propagated the notion that Africans were heathens without history, such findings were a scandal. How could it be that communities in Africa not only possessed history, but claimed the most sacred of all histories, the bloodline of Israel? The fear of African Hebrew kingdoms was not only theological, but also political. In the colonial era, European powers justified their conquest by portraying Africa as devoid of civilization, literacy, and divine purpose. The discovery of Hebrew traditions shattered this myth. If Africans were keepers of the Ark, if they were descendants of Solomon, if they had preserved the lost books of the Bible, then colonialism was not a civilizing mission but a theft of something sacred. Even worse, it suggested that the European narrative of racial superiority had been a lie. To admit that African Hebrew kingdoms existed was to admit that Europe had enslaved and colonized the very descendants of biblical Israel, a possibility that struck at the heart of Christian conscience. This tension became particularly pronounced in the age of the transatlantic slave trade. Among the enslaved Africans taken to the Americas were many from regions with strong Israelite traditions, including the Igbo. Slave narratives in the Americas frequently described Africans comparing themselves to the Israelites of Egypt, singing spirituals of deliverance and identifying with Moses, Pharaoh, and the Promised Land. European theologians, slave owners, and colonizers were deeply unsettled by this identification, for it suggested that the Africans were not merely captives but chosen people undergoing a second exodus. The biblical parallels were so strong that they threatened the entire theological justification of slavery. If the enslaved were Israel, then the enslavers were Egypt, a truth too dangerous for European scholars to admit openly. It is telling that when European academics wrote about African Hebrew traditions, they often did so with a mixture of fascination and denial. They collected manuscripts from Ethiopia, but dismissed Ethiopian claims of Solomonic descent as fable. They recorded Igbo and Lemba practices, but categorized them as primitive distortions. They acknowledged Hebrew words and practices among Africans, but attributed them to accidental resemblance. In each case, the instinct was to downplay, to sidestep, to obscure, because to take African Hebrew kingdoms seriously was to dismantle the European monopoly over biblical identity. Even in the modern era, traces of this fear linger. The global recognition of Ethiopian Jews, the Beta Israel, who were airlifted to Israel in the 20th century, came only after decades of doubt and dismissal by European and Israeli authorities. The reluctance to acknowledge them as authentic Jews reflected centuries of European discomfort with African claims to Hebraic heritage. Similarly, African American movements that identified with the lost tribe of Israel, from the early Black Hebrews of the 19th century to the contemporary African Hebrew Israelites, have been met with skepticism, derision, or outright hostility from mainstream European and American scholars. The fear remains the same, that the true scope of Israel's legacy may not be confined to Europe and the Middle East, but deeply rooted in Africa. Ultimately, the terror of European scholars lay not in the existence of these kingdoms themselves, but in the story they told. The story was that Africa was not a blank canvas awaiting Europe's imprint, but a living library of divine memory, a continent that carried within its people and kingdoms the oldest echoes of Israel. To admit this was to rewrite world history, to dethrone Europe from its self-appointed role as guardian of civilization, and to recognize that Africa had always been central to the biblical drama. That recognition was too revolutionary, too destabilizing, too threatening to the structures of empire and theology. And so, for centuries, it was suppressed, ignored, and denied. But history has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it is buried. The manuscripts of Ethiopia endure. The oral traditions of the Igbo and Lemba persist. The memory of African Hebrews continues to be sung in spirituals and whispered in families. Europe's fear could not erase Africa's truth. It only delayed the world from hearing it.